Hello to the Graphene community. This is Mike Trisko, and I'm here to give you an update on the Graphene blockchain. And what I wanted to start out with is just to tell you a little bit about what I think is really different and special about Graphene. And then I will move on to some of the questions that people have asked, mostly on the technical side. We will have most likely another update coming more on the marketing side. So this will be focusing more on the technical aspects. To start out, again, one of the things that I think is really different about Graphene compared to many other blockchain projects is that it is really truly decentralized. And you hear that all the time in the blockchain world. You know, everyone thinks, oh, mine is decentralized, they're all decentralized, or they're not decentralized. I think there is a wide range, but one of the ways that I think about that is that there are many aspects to it. One is the distribution of the coins itself, where in many cases, especially if there was some sort of ICO or fundraising that was done, that you end up with either the developers or the team having a very high percentage of the supply, or you might have investors like venture capitalists or others that might have a high percentage of the supply. And that can cause problems because it might mean that there is actually a small group that really controls what happens on the blockchain. And that is one aspect where I think For and Graphene really shine, that because of the history of it, we never raised any public or private funding. It was really all bootstrapped by the community. It's a very community-driven project from the very start. In fact, even For started out as an airdrop when it was a separate coin called Cryptcoin, and then that was swapped over to For when For launched in 2017. And now that we've spun off the Graphene project from that, it's another airdrop to For owners, to Graphene holders. So from the very start, it was a fair airdrop system where everyone got one share. And then from that point, it was just whoever wanted to buy it and hold it. And I think if you look at the distribution of For, which would most likely match pretty closely to the distribution of Graphene, but of course you can also look directly at the distribution of Graphene on the BSC Explorer at this point. You'll see that there isn't any single holder that has a very large percentage of it. Even our team has a relatively low percentage when you look at the total. I think overall we might have 10% combined throughout the whole team, but that means 90% is all throughout the community. And so I think that is one of the strengths that we have is, number one, that we have that high distribution. So another piece of that follows from the same idea is that we don't have any obligations to like a venture capital firm, that really the community is in charge of exactly what we do. Usually when you have a venture capitalist involved, they have lots of strings attached to the funding that they give you, and they're looking for an exit at some point. So it really helps to be independent of that. And I think that's one of the strengths. I think that's really the vision of what decentralized projects should be. And so I'm very proud of that we've been able to maintain that, and that we're able to act as a community all together and make our own decisions on where we want to take the project. And that's something that I expect to carry through, not just from For, but also into Graphene, to make sure that this is a very community-led project. Even if you look at some of the very popular smart contract platforms that you might compare Graphene to, you'll see that many of them have either done an ICO, or the development team has a high percentage of the tokens, and that means that they ultimately have control over what happens. And that means that the community, while they might have a voice to some extent, really doesn't have direct control over it. And I think that's something we've built into Graphene from the very start, both in the architecture itself as well as how everything has been managed. So I'm a member of the community just like you. I'm certainly doing a lot of work on the blockchain, but that's also open to anybody. Anyone who wants to volunteer or help contribute to either the development itself or to the marketing or to any other aspect of the project. We're a community and we're working together on this. And that's something that I think is going to lead to our success in the future, given that being independent, being something that can't really be controlled by a central entity, I think is one of the core differences in the blockchain world. And I think that is something we should work hard as a community to maintain over time. Along with that, the regulatory risk, I think, has also gone down a lot, or goes down a lot when you have this sort of setup. Certainly the Howey test is used to decide whether or not a coin is a security. And that usually the first question on that Howey test is, did you raise funds? And so since our answer is no, it really almost guarantees that we would never have that kind of regulatory risk. And so you'll see that some Exchanges, for example, might say they only want to have tokens that are not considered securities, or they might exclude certain types of tokens because of those regulatory risks. And I think we're completely free of that, where we won't have to worry about having a regulatory scrutiny coming and saying we're a security and trying to shut us down, because there really is no possibility for that in our case. And at the same time, I think another aspect that I think is very unique, or at least uncommon in this type of world, is that we have a built-in DAO, and have from the start in 4, and that's something we're also carrying forward to Graphene, where there will be a certain number of coins that will be created every period to fund development and marketing and community and development growth. So I think that's really, in my mind, a much better system that replaces the funding that you might have gotten from an ICO. Because if you do some sort of initial funding, whether it's on an exchange or coin offering, or I guess the DEX is the latest iteration of that, that's a one-time cash infusion, right? Like you'll have that funding to get you started, but then eventually it runs out. And I think there's a big question as to what happens when it does run out, because if there is no revenue model or business model behind that, then what's going to happen to all the development? What's going to happen to all the work that's being put into it when it can no longer be funded by that? I think the DAO structure we have in 4 that we're planning to build into Graphene as well provides more of a perpetual piece of that. And I'll go into a little more detail on that. In the budget governance that's part of that DAO structure within Graphene, everyone has equal access to that. That's one of the key aspects of it, is that there are coins generated by the blockchain, but it's not a privileged thing where only a certain team has access to it, or only certain people have access to it. Anyone in the community, or anyone who wants to join the community, can put in a proposal and say, this is what I'd like to do, and this is how much I'd like to get funded for it. And if the community decides that that's a good idea, then they vote for it, and they can say, yes, you're going to get funded for that. And the flip side is true as well. If they think it's a bad idea, they can not fund that. And if there's nothing funded, then there's no new coins created. So the community really maintains ultimate control over that, which I think is a really strong structure, which also, again, fits in well with the regulatory frameworks we've seen both in the United States and elsewhere, where it's treated differently, because the structure that we have set up is more like you're getting paid for work that you do. And that's a very different concept than saying we're going to take a whole bunch of money from investors up front and then hopefully deliver something on the back end that will deliver value, because that gets into this really dicey territory of potentially thinking, okay, people invested in something expecting a passive return. That's really the kind of the core concept behind the Howey test that people use in the SEC and other places to decide whether something's a security. And that, again, that's a very different thing than saying you're actually actively participating, you're doing work, and you're getting paid for that work. And so I think it gives us a much cleaner way of funding it. But again, it's perpetual, it's forever. You don't have that money running out. Certainly there are pros and cons to it. I mean, it would be nice to have millions of dollars up front to be able to fund a team, and that has some advantages to it that are obvious. But I think having a smaller amount that's generated over time, I think ultimately in the long run will pay off, because you have the ability to have that every period, and as the project is more successful and the value of the coin goes up, then the value of that budget also goes up. So you have a virtuous cycle that says the more people are using the blockchain, the more people are getting value from it. That'll get reflected in the development budget naturally. It doesn't have to have some increased funding externally, that it will naturally build on itself and have that virtuous cycle where the more value we deliver, the more value we get back from it. And so I think that's a very strong structure. But we didn't stop there either. One of the other aspects that we built into the Graphene architecture is what we call shard governance. And that's where one of the key concepts within Graphene is to say we can have different types of shard blockchains. So for example, we're starting out with a transfer blockchain that would be somewhat similar to what you would imagine for a Bitcoin type of blockchain, where it's giving you fast, secure transfers between different accounts. And it allows those types of transactions to go across the network. And then another shard that we have planned is the smart contract blockchain, and that would be a lot more analogous to the Ethereum blockchain. Both of those can coexist on the same network within Ethereum, which I think is a difference between both Bitcoin and Ethereum, because I think both of them are most likely going to stay relatively close to what they're planning to do and having the same shards in the case of Ethereum 2.0 and being somewhat homogeneous in terms of the capabilities, whereas within Graphene we can have that diversity of different types of shards. But we've extended that concept to say that we'd also like that to be decentralized, in the sense that anyone can write a shard, anyone can propose to add that shard to the network, and the community can review that. And if they find it acceptable, if we've reviewed the code and we think it's all safe and we think it's a good thing to add and it's going to add value to the network, then the community can decide to add that. And if they don't, then it stays out. So the community, again, has very good control over exactly how the network grows and what capabilities we add. And part of the architecture is also that it would allow those shards to go live automatically once it has been voted in, so that you wouldn't even necessarily need to upgrade your software to have that go live, because the concept is really built along the lines of a smart contract to some extent, where it's saying, okay, we can upload this new code to the network, and the network knows how that plugs into the rest of the network, because there's a standard API between the shards and the rest of the system. And so as long as it complies to that shard API, then you would be able to bring that new shard live automatically and just say, okay, now I can decide if my node is going to also recognize this shard and allow that to be part of what my nodes are working on, for example. So I think this is really an innovative thing. There aren't a whole lot of other blockchains that have that type of capability, and I don't think places like Bitcoin or Ethereum or a lot of the other major blockchains you might look at are going to do that, because I think they like to maintain their centralized control that their team has over what gets put into the code. So I think while they certainly might listen to feedback from the community, they don't necessarily always go along with what the community wants. So I think part of our core value proposition here is to allow the community to really drive the direction of the project and to work together to make this a great network that has great capabilities that would far exceed what we think any other project might provide. So that's one of the main things that I wanted to point out. The next topic I wanted to cover is what's referred to as the blockchain trilemma. And that's a very common concept that, again, you'll hear a lot in terms of how people look at different cryptocurrencies and their strengths and weaknesses. And what it really gets down to is there's three different aspects that you typically need to optimize for or decide how to trade off for. And those three elements are security, scalability, and decentralization. And if you look at most blockchains, a lot of times they are trading off at least one of those to make the other two work. For example, Bitcoin is really putting a high value on both security and decentralization. That's one of the reasons why they keep their blocks small and they keep the block times at 10 minutes as opposed to something shorter, because they want to make sure there's a lot of security around each transaction being validated and each block being validated. And they also want to make sure that there can be a lot of nodes running on the network, so they don't want to have too much of a technical requirement on those nodes. But as a result, they have a lot lower scalability than most other solutions. And they're looking at a layer 2 solution with their Lightning Network to try and remedy that, but that has its own issues of saying you may be giving up some of that security or other things when you go to that layer, because again, they're trying to work around this trilemma where they're saying, okay, if I have to give up something here to get that, then I'll swap it. So when you look at the Lightning Network, you might have a different mix of what's a strength and a weakness, but you're still going to have that same trade-off that they're working on. Whereas some of the other more modern blockchains, especially the ones that have come about after Ethereum, where they're trying to assess the scalability and get that solved, they are most likely giving up something like decentralization in many cases, where they might only have a small number of nodes that are processing them that are really high in their technical requirements. And that, again, you're giving up that decentralization, which means potentially the whole blockchain could be attacked by whether it's a government or even just hackers or other things, where they can say, okay, I know which nodes are handling this, and so they can find them, they can potentially shut them down, and it could potentially harm the functioning of the network, which is a lot harder to do if you have high decentralization. And so in many cases, these trade-offs are there if you look for them. And I think what we have with Graphene is somewhat of a solution for this. And I think part of that is that it's a very modular blockchain, that it has a separation of the consensus and the data and the execution layers. And those are technical concepts that we could dive deeper into if you want to learn more about them. But the consensus layer is essentially, where do you decide what the best block or the best set of transactions is? And so you have to get all the nodes on the network to agree. so that you're all looking at the same blockchain and you're agreeing on what that data looks like and that it's immutable over time and those sorts of things. Whereas the data layer is really handling all the data around those transactions, whether it is a smart contract transaction or whether it's just a regular type of transfer transaction. But in some cases they could be very large, so that potentially has a lot of work associated with it. But even just validating those pieces of data is a big job in itself. And then the execution layer typically refers more to how do you actually process the transaction. So in the case of smart contracts, for example, it's running the smart contract. And when you look at the current Ethereum, those are all wrapped together. I think the Ethereum 2.0 is meant to address some of the same things, but they're taking a very different approach as well, where I think from the latest announcements from them, they're actually looking to outsource some of the data layer and other things to actually other blockchains, whereas Graphene is looking to encompass all of this in a single ecosystem where it's all tied together and everything's validated together, and it can all maintain that security across the system while still having that high scalability and the high decentralization. Graphene has different nodes that are processing those different layers, so the work is distributed to different nodes at different times. The nodes are also being swapped between roles over time, and that part of that is done with a random algorithm so that you can make sure you're not going to be able to predict exactly what you're going to be doing next, which helps prevent people from trying to game the system in some ways. And it's distributed where not every node needs to do every job, but you still have so many nodes because it's designed to have thousands of nodes that would be running it all the time, that you still have enough of a consensus layer there. You have enough different nodes that have to agree that you still have high security and you have that decentralization, along with being able to be highly scalable and adding new shards, adding more validators, being able to scale the network up. So I think it is actually a very great solution. And the net result of that, I think, is that it allows the fees for transactions to remain low, but also having enough volume going through the system that you're able to compensate validator nodes for everything that they're doing without having the issuance rate, the new coins that are produced, be too high over time. And I think that's the net problem that you're really trying to solve by having all three of those aspects, is being able to say you want the block space essentially to be valuable. You want it to deliver value to users where they want to use it. And so you have a lot of demand for block space, but you also don't want to be creating so many rewards that it's diluting the value over time. And so I think that that's ultimately what we're shooting for here, is to have a good reward structure that will be profitable to run a node, but it also isn't creating such a overabundance of supply that it would cause a problem in the long term. And I think you will see some of those problems for some of these other blockchains that are having very high issuance rates, where ultimately they're not necessarily going to be able to recoup those in fees. They're not going to be able to really balance out their supply versus demand, where I think the Graphene architecture really does have a good structure for that. It has a variable reward structure as well, which really is meant to match the supply and demand curve. So if there's less activity on the network, less coins will be produced. And that means it'll naturally stabilize the value more than it would if it was just always giving out the same number of rewards all the time, regardless of what's happening. And if there is more activity, then it would have an incremental amount, not linearly, but it would have an additional amount that it would create, and that would potentially match that additional demand, where when you have more users and more activity, then you would potentially want to have more coins so that everyone can participate, and you don't have the opposite problem of saying that nobody wants to spend their coins because it's going way up in value, or it's having a lot of volatility like you see in these things. So I think it has a stability mechanism in there that's very attractive as well. All right, so I think that gets to some of the points I wanted to go over from a technical standpoint to just help you understand what's different about this, what's special about this. I'm very excited about it, and I hope you are too. I'll shift gears now to saying, where are we going from here? Graphene was issued as an airdrop to 4 owners on the BSC blockchain as tokens, and that was done because we wanted to be able to provide that to users before we were ready to launch the mainnet. We thought that was the best way to go about it, and it would allow people to have liquidity. It would also allow new investors, new users to come into the ecosystem. And it also actually serves a purpose in terms of setting some of the initial values so that we know how some of the crypto economics should work. And let me get into some of that a little later as well. But, that was issued at a 10-to-1 ratio to people who held 4 through all the 6 airdrops that we did. Unfortunately, we did have issues because some of the snapshots that were taken from the 4 blockchain were incorrect. So we had to kind of stop what we're doing and put a pause on that and fix that to make sure everyone was going to get the right number of tokens. We have corrected all of that now. I think all the snapshots, once you've redeemed all 6 of them, would get everybody the correct amounts. Took a lot of work to get there, but I think we got there. I know there are some 4 owners that still haven't been able to redeem their tokens, so don't think that I'm not aware of that. We are working with each user to get that resolved, and we are fully committed to doing that. So that is really one of our top priorities right now, is just making sure all those issues have been resolved. Even for cases where the fixes that we've already uploaded in terms of updated smart contracts won't work, we have another solution where we minted some additional tokens that would be able to be given out to people once we've done the proper validation, so that you would get the proper number of tokens. And that will be accounted for in the overall supply, in the sense that if you can't redeem them the normal way, you'd get them that way, and then they would be removed from the other ones, so the net supply would stay the same. So I think we have a solution for everyone at this point. We just have to go through each person and do the validation for each person. So unfortunately, it's taken more time than we certainly have liked, but we are going to get that done for you. So rest assured that we are committed to making sure everyone can redeem the number of tokens that they want to redeem in terms of what they were allocated. So that's still part of our task. And then from there, as we complete that, we're turning our attention back to moving Graphene towards the mainnet launch. The next big task that we're working on is to design and implement the front-end wallet. Most of the work on the back end is complete. So what we're looking for now is just to have that way that users can interface with the blockchain. So what we're planning to do is initially to develop a web extension type of wallet, similar to something like MetaMask, where you'll be able to plug that into your browser and generate addresses and receive and send funds and do all the things that you would need to do to interact with the blockchain. Ultimately, it would also help with some of the smart contract functions, where you might be interacting with a website that provides the interface to a smart contract application. So that's our task that we're working on now. I think that's the next important step, because we have run test nets in the past with just the back end, and a lot of those were successful in terms of being able to process beacon blocks and things like that. We have the initial shard for the transfer shard all developed, but we need that initial interface for users. So once we have that ready, we're going to look at getting another testnet up and running so that people can use that wallet and interact with the blockchain and put everything through its paces, and see what other issues we might need to iron out before we get ready for the mainnet launch. And at that point, we will move forward with planning and executing the launch of mainnet. There's a lot of work involved in that step as well. One of them is that we need to include a system for converting those BSC tokens into native coins on the Graphene mainnet. So that'll be part of that launch process, is to understand how we're going to do that and communicate that clearly to everyone, and provide a process where you can make that conversion so that you'd be able to participate in the Graphene network as we get into the launch, and you can run validators and do staking and all the things that we want people to be able to do. So that's essentially the path forward. I know people want dates, but unfortunately we do have a lot of work to do, and we don't know how many issues we're going to find as we go through testing, so I really can't provide specific dates. But as we get closer to those milestones, we certainly will communicate those dates to you. When we have an opportunity for you to participate in testnet, that'll be the next big step in terms of how the community can get involved. So whether you're looking to develop things or whether you're looking to just use them and try them out, that you'll be able to do that on the testnet once we get to that point. And then, of course, we'll be communicating all along the way as we get closer to mainnet launch, and allow you to convert your tokens into coins and participate as a validator as we get closer to the initial launch. So that's where we're at, and that's where we're going. And I'll shift to the final section of what I wanted to talk about today, which is just to answer some of your questions. So there's a set of them, I think maybe 8 or 9 that we've collected that I want to go through. One question is, what will happen to the extra Graphene tokens that were minted, both to help the airdrop issue and to anybody who had issues claiming, or anyone that didn't claim the airdrop? So at this point, we are planning on at some point cutting off the redemption process. I think tentatively we're looking at potentially January of next year. That allows for anyone who has tax issues to potentially put it into a new tax year. And I think that allows enough time for anybody to get the tokens they need. And again, for anyone having issues, we will take care of you, so you don't need to worry about that. And if we need to, we'll push that date out if we need to, just to make sure that everyone has had a chance to do it. But we want to make sure that we do get everybody an opportunity to get the tokens, and at that point, we will eventually cut off the process so that we have more certainty over what the supply looks like. For any additional tokens that were minted, whether it is for the airdrop or anything that is left unclaimed after we finish that process, the plan is that those would be burned. I mean, the ultimate idea was that we would allow people to redeem those tokens, but we wouldn't do anything else with them. So I think that most likely is the direction we're heading, but I will say that we are open to other potential ideas from the community. So if there was a strong desire from the community to potentially reallocate some of those tokens to things like additional development, or other participation things that people could potentially work on to help the project, I'm certainly open to discussing that. So if you want to talk through that, whether it's on our Discord or Telegram, feel free to do that and we can have those discussions. But I think the default is that we would just let everyone redeem the tokens that they want to redeem, and then at the end of the process we would cut it off, and that would be the end of it. And any additional tokens, we would probably have regular events potentially to just burn portions of those tokens so that people know exactly what happens and when it happened and how it happened. We certainly want to maintain transparency through the process. So that's essentially the plan. So hopefully that answers that question. If you do have further questions on that, feel free to reach out. Another question we have is, can we expect any new exchanges in the future? And I do have a strong perspective on this that I'd like to share. The main one is that we think decentralized exchanges are really the better option. Right now for Graphene, we have that on the BSC blockchain. Certainly if we had tokens that moved to other blockchains, we could participate in those decentralized exchanges as well. And I do think that it's very likely that once we have the mainnet launched, that someone would develop a similar ecosystem of exchanges on Graphene. So from my standpoint, and again, this is just me as a member of the community myself too, I don't really see the attraction of centralized exchanges, so I don't really think we're going to be trying to pursue that. I think there's a lot more issues, whether it's regulatory issues or potentially having problems with the exchange if it goes down, if somebody hacks them, that sorts of things. I think that's much more likely to happen on a centralized exchange, which people who have been in the fork community have seen that happen a couple of times to exchanges that we're trading for. So I think the decentralized exchanges really are a better solution. And I think even having too many of those might even be more of an issue because it spreads out the liquidity. It makes it easier for bots to potentially take advantage of people. So personally, I think as long as everyone has the ability to trade, that essentially solves that problem. Now, I do understand that people might want it to be on their favorite exchange. They might want to have more visibility or pull in other investors that might only use certain exchanges. So if there is community demand for that, and if there's funding for that, I'm certainly open to that, just again, as a member of the community like anyone else. So we can have those discussions and we can look at whether people want to fund or help fund those sorts of things. But that's essentially how I'm looking at it. And I think right now we have the ability to trade on the BSC PancakeSwap exchange. There may be future exchanges. Again, primarily DEXs would be what I'd be looking for in the future. But I think to me that potentially solves that issue. And in the future, of course, if exchanges want to add Graphene, they're welcome to do so. It's just that I know the reality because I've been doing this for a number of years now, that a lot of these exchanges are really just interested in getting large fees for listing a coin. And as a decentralized project, I think it's a much better use of our funding to fund development than it is to pay a bunch of exchanges for just listing our coins. So that's my perspective. I know some people might not agree with me, but that's how I think about it. All right, so another question actually is relating to 4. It's saying, what is next for 4, and will 4 become part of the Graphene ecosystem eventually, or will it continue to stay as its own project? This update is really meant to be focusing on Graphene, so I won't go too deeply into that, but I will say that the intention at this point is for it to maintain independent status as a separate project. There will be another update that will come in the future as far as what we have planned for that. There is a future roadmap that we have in mind for that, and there's also a lot of ideas we may consider from the community in terms of where they want to take it. But one of the reasons we spun off Graphene as a separate project is that 4 was really, it really had its own identity, mostly as an e-commerce related blockchain. And when we saw what graphene was capable of, we felt like it would not make any sense at all to just say that that's an upgrade to 4, which was the original idea. But when we saw what it could do, we said this needs to be launched as its own project because it has so many capabilities, and it needs to really start with a fresh identity and have its own project that will take it in that direction and not be weighed down by any perceptions that might have been tied to 4. But I still think 4 has a very healthy future ahead of it. I think it has a lot of development that we want to do to it to build out that ecosystem and a lot of the ideas that we have around that. So again, we can address that separately in another session. Regarding the specific question about it becoming part of the graphene ecosystem, I certainly do expect that we would have tokens on graphene, and so that would be a technical capability. I don't really see that as anything we're currently planning or envisioning to do, partly because it would essentially mean that everything would need to be redeveloped. You know, the 4 marketplace and all the other things we have that are built out around the 4 ecosystem now would have to be completely rewritten to work under a token structure. And so it would essentially take a lot of work just to get back to where we are with 4. So I don't really see necessarily a lot of value in doing that. Now, again, if there was enough community demand and there was enough reasons that we discussed and agreed to for that being a good idea, I'd certainly be open to that as well. But I just think at this point it makes more sense for it to stay as a separate project and go down its own path, independent of the graphene blockchain. All right. The next question is someone wanted to hear about practical applications of the graphene technology and what plans the team has to bring those to market. It's really difficult to narrow down the practical applications because I think it's kind of an endless possibility sort of thing. The tremendous flexibility we have with the different shard types means that you could have essentially any kind of cryptocurrency blockchain that we wanted to add to the system. So we could add potentially, decentralized storage blockchain that's optimized for that type of application. We could have a social media blockchain that's optimized for that. We could have a privacy blockchain or an identity blockchain. The possibilities really are endless. So it's hard for me to say, here's the practical applications without just saying it's kind of whatever you could imagine. So it is a challenging question for me to answer. I do think in the near term, I would expect that once we launch the Graphene mainnet, a lot of the capabilities that you see on some of the smart contract platforms would be the most likely ones to get built out on top of the Graphene platform. So I would expect we'd have token standards that we'd settle on very quickly. We would most likely see decentralized exchanges, at least one, if not multiple. Most likely a bunch of DeFi projects would potentially find the platform attractive based on a lot of the attributes and characteristics that we're building into it. Most likely we would have NFT capabilities along with the native tokens, and potentially even other DAOs, other decentralized autonomous organizations, where they might say this is a good platform to build a community and a good platform to potentially interact with their users. So I think those are some of the things that I would kind of expect to happen. So as far as immediate practical applications, I would expect those to be built out first. But then it could go anywhere from that. Again, you could have potentially something where you're storing large amounts of content. You could have something that required very high privacy applications to it. A lot of different things that it could go in different directions, especially with the new shard types that people could add. So again, I think that's a very distinguishing characteristic where you can have different attributes, meaning different consensus rules. So if you wanted to have different block times or different block sizes or different rules around what transactions can happen and how they happen, a different shard can do that, and you can have different trade-offs that say, if you want to do this type, here's the best place to do it. If you want to do this other type of transaction, here's the best place to do it. But they're all tied within the same ecosystem, so they can also work together. So I think if I just generalize that a little bit, again, I've talked about things like decentralized storage, privacy, identity. I think gaming and social media and communities are a bunch of other niches that potentially could benefit from this type of technology, because I think what you'll see is it'll have fast confirmation times and finalization times. So you'll have good immutability. You'll have low fees with high scalability. I think that makes it very good for anything that would benefit from micropayments or high volumes of transactions, or anything that has custom requirements that might need an optimized blockchain or a different type of blockchain, but also wants to potentially have access to a broader ecosystem. So I think those are the types of things I would look for if you're looking at a potential use case to say, why would I use Graphene? Is that it has those extra capabilities that most other blockchains just wouldn't provide. All right. The next question is, can Graphene really have 100,000 transactions per second? So this is a number that's been thrown around. We haven't finalized exactly what we think the number is, but I do actually feel pretty comfortable that 100,000 transactions per second is achievable for the architecture. Really that's based on saying, how many shards can we have and how many transactions can each shard process, because they can all process transactions in parallel. And I think based on the way the system works, that's really governed by how many attestation transactions the beacon chain can store over a given time period. And that number is pretty high. I think it's easily in the thousands, where you could have thousands of shards that are processing transactions at the same time. And so as the network grows and we have the need for that kind of capacity, I think it's very achievable that we could have thousands of shards running at the same time. Many of them might be the same type of shards, so that you could have lots of smart contract shards and lots of transfer shards and whatever other types we decide to add. And so you'd have the scalability you need for the types of transactions that you need, and they would be able to scale up as that demand grows, to handle more and more transactions. And I think the maximum would only be governed by saying, okay, do we have room for another shard, essentially? And that's a pretty large number. So I'm pretty comfortable with that type of figure. I think it actually could be much higher, but I wouldn't want to make any sort of promises until we actually test out the system and see how it behaves. So certainly there's some of that still ahead of us, but I think, to me, that's actually potentially a conservative estimate. So I am pretty comfortable with that, but we'll have to see exactly how it plays out as we get the system live and as we put it through its paces. All right. There's a question about marketing plans for Graphene. Now, I will kind of defer that. I think Thomas is most likely going to put out a separate update for that. So I don't really want to get into the marketing plans. I think this was meant to be more of a technical update, but I at least wanted to mention that we heard you. We wanted that you had that question, and there will be more information coming out from Thomas regarding that. All right. Next one is, will the BSC Graphene token be converted to, will it be obligatory to convert it to a native Graphene token, or will they be circulating simultaneously? And what will be the supply? I think I kind of already addressed the supply of the native Graphene, that initially that would essentially be what people have redeemed. But from there, I think the question of whether or not it would be obligatory is, I think the answer is no. There's nobody that's going to force you to turn them in. We're not going to take them away from you. I think we actually will look to see if we can make some sort of two-way bridge between the BSC ecosystem and the Graphene ecosystem, and I think that would be the best solution. So if we can work that out, I think that's what we would plan to do, is to say you can convert it to a native token and then use it on the Graphene ecosystem, but when you want to, you could potentially also move it back to the BSC ecosystem. And that's a pretty well-known solution at this point. Just like many coins do have the ability to move or wrap tokens and move them to a different ecosystem. I think we could certainly work out a solution like that, so that even if you do decide you want to move some or all of your tokens over to the Graphene ecosystem, you could maintain some on the BSC ecosystem if you felt like you wanted to do that, or you could move them over there if you wanted to use PancakeSwap or one of the other applications that's over there. So I think that's essentially how we're looking at that. But again, this is all open to discussion, and we can finalize that as we get closer to the launch. There will be a mechanism for doing it, which from a user perspective might be somewhat similar to what we did doing the airdrop from 4 to Graphene, but it obviously would be very different in many technical ways, because we're moving from a smart contract blockchain to another smart contract blockchain, and it would be more of a one-to-one transfer as opposed to an airdrop. So there will be a lot of differences to the process, but from a user standpoint, it would most likely work in a similar way, where you might